Okay, last week I raised the issue of what's called the crowbar case, which is Phineas Gage. And he was a railroad worker who had an iron bar shot up through his cheekbone and out through the top of his head. I mentioned how children can grow up believing different things depending on what their parents believed. Now, unfortunately, I have been told by someone close to me that I didn't make the link with the scriptural passage too well, and I actually agree with her. So here I attempt to make that link. We were looking at verse 5 to 7 last week, but verse 7 in particular causes concern. What then, says Paul? What Israel is seeking, it has not obtained, but those who were chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. Predestination. It's a sovereign matter with God. And in raising the issue of Phineas Gage and children whose minds are shaped, I should have asked the question, who is truly free? Right? Who is truly free? Because free will is actually set against predestination. So my point being is that we are really not truly free to choose because, in fact, we have all been conditioned to one degree or another. We have been conditioned. Children are conditioned by who raises them, where they are raised, and under what conditions they are raised. And this goes on to shape and to even dictate the choices that they make for themselves. And they do it under the assumption that they are truly free in making those choices. This is why it's important to get the Word of God into your kids. Why it's vital. Because they're going to be dictated to by someone, either the secular, atheistic culture we have out there or by Christian values. You see, nothing is neutral. We are indoctrinated from the minute we are born. Nothing is neutral. And how we're raised shapes our choices. Phineas Gage, he had his brain severely damaged. And of course, he was not in control of his faculties, and he became, according to his family and friends, another person altogether. His personality changed. The choices he was making changed. You see, the frontal lobe, where it was damaged, is apparently where the decision-making processes of your brain happen. That's where they're located. So in the end result, predestination, from these examples I gave you, sort of doesn't seem that silly after all, does it? Especially when we consider that our so-called free will is actually very constrained. We find also that the human race is just so tainted by sin and its self-desires that it truly doesn't know up from down, nor truth from falsehood. That's the state of the world. But God has intervened, hasn't he? He has opened the door for some, and this becomes our basis for our encouragement, that we have been chosen out of this world to be his people. And Damo put it well at home group. He noted that the upside for the kid who gets picked from a line of other kids to be on the basketball team is a great encouragement for that child, because they're picked out of all the others there to be on that team. So hopefully this has clarified somewhat some of the missing links of last week. But as we look at the passage today, it's actually going to expand and clarify much of what we looked at last week. So the question I start with today is this: is Israel doomed beyond recovery? And Paul says, no, not at all. He says, he himself is a Jew, and he was not rejected. He, in fact, was chosen in spite of his persecuting zeal against Christ himself, against the church. And also, whilst we may think that we are on our own, like poor Elijah, there are many more that God, in fact, knows about. And there was the example there of Elijah, who was thinking that he was the only one faithful to God. And yet God says there's a sizable remnant of Israel that are mine, that are saved. We spoke about the animosity between Jews and the Gentile church, in how the Jews not only rejected Christ, but they were actually encouraging the Roman authorities to persecute the church. Now, can you imagine how the early church felt about that? Imagine how those Gentile Christians reacted to that. You can understand truly why the Gentile Christians were so negative against Israel. But Paul is saying that that ought not cloud them nor us from recognizing that God's grace also comes upon some in Israel. But there is something even more to consider here. The Apostle Paul moves on to explain why the rest of Israel were hardened and why Israel is in fact not beyond recovery. So there was a purpose that God had in hardening Pharaoh. Do you remember that? We've been through that in Romans. How God hardened Pharaoh. And through the hardening of Pharaoh, the world got to learn about and witness the power of God as he poured out his judgments upon the so-called gods of Egypt, destroyed the Egyptian confidence in those gods, and the encouragement to his people as well to see how great he is in fact. And through this we know the family of Rahab and their faith that was ignited by coming to know the God of all creation. And that happened through what God did in revealing himself to the world in those great revelations, rescuing his people, the Israelites, from the rage of Pharaoh as he pursued them through the Red Sea. There, he parted the sea, he brought his people through safely, and then he drowned the Egyptian army who was chasing them. So divine hardening of Pharaoh had a greater purpose than merely the existential salvation of Israel, more than their present experience of being saved. So too, Paul is saying here that there is a purpose for God in hardening Israel. And that is so God would reveal his grace to Gentiles. In other words, most of us here are Gentiles, and we are here because of God's purpose in hardening Israel. Do you recognise that? When Mel Gibson was filming The Passion of the Christ, he came under severe fire for implicating the Jews in the killing of Jesus. He had a lot of critics against him for that. And you know, it's the usual nonsense we hear from the cultural elites. So you can bring out the truth against Christian colonisation, but you can't bring out the truth if it happens to be a minority group. Now, I know this is a side issue from what we're talking about, but it's something we need to understand about what's happening in our world today, isn't it? But let me remind you about this passage from Leviticus 19. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the great, but you are to judge your neighbour fairly. So in other words, you're not to judge differently because one group is perhaps a majority group and one's a minor group, or one's a small, insignificant, and one's great. God says when you make a judgment, you judge justly and fairly. You do not consider the situation of the person in making that judgment. Truth is truth, and you are to judge fairly. But getting back to my point here, the hardening of Israel is an obvious allusion to the crucifixion of Christ. So, a week before Jesus is crucified, they were all cheering his entrance into Jerusalem. Look at it here in John chapter 12. It says, on the next day, the large crowd who had come to the feast, when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, took the branches of the palm trees and went out to meet him and began to shout, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel." And then a week later, what were they saying? They cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" And Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So the Jews were hardened in order that the Gentiles might have the salvation of God opened up to them. And so John reminds us of this at the beginning of his gospel, where he writes, "He, Jesus, came to that which was his own, Israel. But his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children not born of natural descent, nor of human decision, nor a husband's will, but born of God." So what Paul is writing to us today about is this, that the hardening of Israel has actually meant riches for the Gentiles. Israel rejected God's purposes in Jesus Christ. Therefore, God has opened up the door for Gentiles to come in to the kingdom. You have the same thing occurring in Jesus' parable of the king, this king who gave a wedding feast for his son. There's an allusion here to the Father and the Son, Jesus. The honoured guests of the wedding were actually Israel, God's people. And they were invited to this wedding feast. But then we find in this parable that they refused the invitation from God's servants. And those servants, of course, are the prophets of God. They paid no heed to this invitation in this parable, it says, but they mistreated and actually killed his servants, killed the prophets. So the king, in this parable, our Father in heaven, says in anger, he commands his armies to destroy those murderers and their city. And here there is a clear prophecy regarding the slaughter of the Israelites and the destruction of Jerusalem that took place in 70 AD. A clear prophecy to that. More of his servants then, who are sent out into the streets and highways to bring in as many as they can find, and there the wedding hall was full. So there's an allusion there to the new covenant, the apostles and prophets who went out and brought in Gentiles to Christ. If you want to read about that further, Matthew 22 is where you'll find that parable. So as you cast your mind back to your childhood, did you ever experience a time when you were left behind? I think our daughter Amy, when she was a little girl, had that feeling. We, as in our many family members, mum, dad, brothers, grandparents, uncles, aunties, cousins, we all attended the Southport Church of Christ, and after church we'd all make our way back to Poppy's house for lunch. Well, Amy was a bit of a social butterfly at that time, and she would go mingle with all the other kids of the church. And since all her brothers often went back in cars for having lunch together, they often went back in, the cars of our other family members. We just assumed that Amy was with them. Well, when we were about to eat lunch, someone would say, "Where's Amy?" And oh dear, she must still be at church. And someone would have to go back and collect her. And from memory, this happened twice. I'd have to say at least twice, but I only remember the 2 times. I don't think too much harm came of it, but I'm sure she didn't like the feeling of being left behind. Hence the apostle here, he says that in granting salvation to the Gentiles, Israel are going to feel like they have been left behind and will want to move to rectify the situation. Interestingly, we see here the flip side to the coin of predestination. You see, predestination, it's not an abstract principle that locks a person into a no-win situation. It's not like that. So even though the bulk of Israel has been hardened, through Israel's jealousy of the Gentiles being richly blessed with God's deliverance, they are now provoked into seeking Christ out for themselves. So Paul is still concerned for his own countrymen, Israel. Previously, in Romans 9, verse 2-3, he says that he would even forfeit his own salvation if it meant that his countrymen could be saved, that they would respond to Christ. He has been called an apostle to the Gentiles. He knows that. It was a call from Jesus himself on the road to Damascus. There in Acts chapter 9, when the Lord talks to Ananias, he makes this point about his call to Paul. So Ananias says to the Lord, surely not, this guy has done all this against you. And then the Lord said to Ananias, go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel. His calling was to the Gentiles, but also there Jesus says, to the sons of Israel. Now we all know that Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles. And so now he directs his attention to the people who know him as their apostle, to the Gentiles themselves, here in verse 13. In this passage today it says, but I am speaking to you who are Gentiles. Now he's saying this because there's a bit of a problem here. All right? So he goes on, inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry if somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them. So his mission is to the Gentiles, his mission is to those who are non-Jews, but he says that he magnifies his ministry. I suppose, if you've ever been on the internet and enlarged a photo or anything like that, or magnify a photo, what do? You make it bigger, don't you? You enlarge it, you spread it out more, which is what he's talking about here by including Jews in his evangelism efforts. He's tasked, for Gentiles, but if he can spread out his ministry further, he wants to reach Jews as well. And so now he is asking we Gentiles to consider the source and origin of Israel's call. Soon he's going to make this statement. From the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies. Whose enemies? They're Israel. They, Israel, are enemies for your sake, but from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. For the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. So, whilst the Jews, on the basis of their hideous persecution of Gentile Christians, are, yes, regarded as enemies, they still have a significant history with God. That's what Paul is saying. The patriarchs, especially Abraham, he received that word of promise from God. And this means that he and his descendants were entrusted with the work and mission of God. They had a holy calling. Now we've got to remember, latch onto this, the Gentile Christians have a problem with the Jews, you see. They have a problem with them. They're persecuting them, and they persecuted Jesus too. You see, so they're thinking, they're out. They're out. And we don't want them in. But Israel has a holy calling, Paul says. Now let me investigate this further. To be holy is to be set apart to God for his exclusive use. To be holy is to be a recipient of God's special attention. However, we need to realize that to be holy is not synonymous with salvation. In other words, a holy person is not necessarily a saved person. Here's an example I can give you from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Paul talks here about mixed marriages between, or religiously mixed marriages, a Christian and an unbeliever. And this has happened, of course, prior to them becoming Christian. So he says, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. You see, so Paul is saying that the unbelieving spouse is holified, because that's what sanctify means making holy, is holified through the holy believer. Obviously, that does not equate to salvation. Otherwise, Paul could not have written this afterwards in verse 16. Wife, for all you know, you might save your husband. Husband, for all you know, you might save your wife. The point made here is that if your spouse is an unbeliever, you should stay in the marriage. Your influence is a positive influence that is more likely to draw your unbelieving spouse to Christ rather than had you cut her off by divorce. So holiness is your being used for God's exclusive purposes and with his special attention and blessings which come upon the unbelieving spouse and children. So Paul is talking about this use when he refers here to the first piece of dough being holy. Right? Of course, the dough rises, doesn't it? And becomes a big loaf. It grows outwardly, just like the holy influence of the Christian spouse. So Israel's call and the promise to Abraham was a holy call, a holy one. And therefore, what God has gifted, he is not going to take back. Now, does it mean that all the Israelites are now saved? No, not at all. He's arguing rather that they have not been rejected. They have not been discarded, as in the way the Gentile Christians thought, or perhaps even wished to think. Israelites still have the opportunity to be grafted back into the vine. So just because God opened the door to Gentiles, it hasn't meant that he closed it to the Jews. I want you to notice some of the words he uses here of Gentile Christians and their attitude toward the Jews. Twice in verse 18, he says, don't be arrogant to them. Remember, he's speaking, addressing the Gentiles in the church. Again in verse 20, he says, do not become proud. The New American Standard has conceited. Now, the sense here is that Gentile Christians have become cocky, and believe that they are now better than the Jews. After all, they persecuted Jesus, didn't they? And now they're persecuting us. And they felt justified in thinking that way. You see, this is the backdrop to the how and the why he is writing this section to the church. So, beginning back there in chapter 9, he has to level the playing field against the law-carrying Jews who think they are above the Gentiles and insist that the Gentiles must become Jews in order to be saved. And now, from chapter 11, he levels the playing field against the prideful Gentile Christians who think that God has now chosen them and cast wretched Israel aside, in their opinion. So the apostle is leading up to this crucial finale in his discussion here between the relationship of the Jews and the Gentile Christians. This grand finale he's leading up to, which comes in verse 32. And he says this, for God has shut up all in disobedience so that he may show mercy to all. So the Gentile has no advantage over the Jew, and the Jew has no advantage over the Gentile in respect to God's acceptance and salvation. they are both saved alike through God's Son and servant Jesus. Both groups. And of course, to make his point here to the Gentile Christians, he calls them a wild olive branch that has been grafted into a natural olive tree. In verse 17, but if some of the natural branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them, and became partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward thee, that is, the broken off branches. But if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. So you have two trees here. You have an olive tree that is grown in the wild, and you have a cultivated or a domestic olive tree. Now, the olive tree was used on occasion as an image of Israel in the Old Testament. The Lord called your name, a green olive tree, beautiful in fruit and form. With the noise of a great tumult, he has kindled fire in it, and its branches are worthless. So it was known that a wild olive tree was not a very fruitful tree. Hence the need to have a cultivated olive tree designed to produce more fruit, you see. But when the cultivated olive tree was sick and not producing, or even ready to die, they would graft a wild olive branch into the tree to strengthen or save the life of the tree. It would kind of inject a bit of spark of life into it. And the wild can be grafted into the cultivated tree. But you see, they are not the natural branches. So the wild branches, in a sense, are feasting off someone else's tree that is not even their own. Now, I'm putting it too harshly here, but a parasite feeds off its host, doesn't it? This is too harsh. But the point is this. Gentiles do not support Israel and her holy calling, but that holy calling supports you. So here the focus is not on the nation of Israel as such, but the heritage, the calling that God gave through Abraham. That should be obvious for the wild olive branches as well as the cultivated olive branches that are alike on the tree. Both participate, don't they, in drawing blessings up from the root, you see. However, Israel is the natural recipient of that calling. So if they believe in Jesus, they can slot straight back into that tree as easy as pie. That's what he is saying. Because Israel has a holy calling and heritage. The Gentiles have a pagan one, with the worship and corruption of idols and all the darkness that is associated with a lost world without the light of the Lord. That kind of tree would have been a disaster. What a shocking root to have. So Gentiles are slotted into a Jewish root, not Jews slotted into a Gentile root. But they both stand by grace. So here is a warning shot that Paul fires over the bow of HMAS Gentile. To those Gentile Christians who think that God has replaced ethnic Israel with Gentiles, he gives this warning. And of course, this warning is very applicable to us. In verse 21, he says, "For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either." So what does this mean? It means that the hinge which determines whether you remain in your salvation with God is faith in Jesus. Faith in Jesus. Gentiles stand by their faith in Jesus. And if that faith evaporates, so does that branch from the olive tree. Now, no one likes hearing truth like this, but it is necessary to hear. It is certainly not different from the words of John the Baptist to the Jews. He writes this, "Do not suppose that you can say to yourselves, We have Abraham as our father. For I say to you that from these stones God is able to raise up children to Abraham. And he has. You are here today. You're those stones that God has raised up to himself. You who obey Jesus are the children of Abraham. Likewise, the words of Jesus to the Jews. John 8, verse 39. They answered and said to him, Abraham is our father. And Jesus said to them, if you are Abraham's children, do the deeds of Abraham. So there are two sides to God in this section that Paul is writing to us from. Kindness and severity. And the proviso is that you stay in his kindness and avoid his severity. That makes sense, doesn't it? How may you do this? It's answered there in verse 23. For Israel, he says, if they do not continue in their rejection of faith in Jesus. The same would be true for the Gentile. It all centres on a person's relationship to Jesus. That's the issue. It is faith in him and him alone that secures God to us and us to God. So in summary today, we see in both this message today and the one last week that God has not cast ethnic Israelites aside and barred them from salvation. They still have opportunity if they come to God through the cross of Christ. He, Jesus, is the long-awaited Messiah or ruler of the world. Unlike earthly rulers who use brute force to ensure compliance, Jesus calls us to come follow him. He defeats our greater enemies of sin and death, and that we can live the fullness of life with the glorious hope and confidence of everlasting life. It is through faith in him, through the working of his Spirit in us, that brings us every spiritual blessing from heaven. The world doesn't understand that the serious enemies of life are not from without, but actually from within. Jesus deals with these both in his death and in his resurrection. At his first coming 2,000 years ago, he defeated those inner enemies. And when he comes again, every other enemy will be defeated, including death itself. He's out to defeat enemies, and he has defeated our enemies. And the promise is not just for Gentile believers, but also ethnic Jewish believers, if they come the way of Christ and Christ alone.